So, how to put this? This isn't going to be me reading the article that's up on our website. So, rather than do that, what I'm doing is I'm sort of looking at background theory so people can deal with that. Okay. So, there's the question of the Green New Deal. There's actually two questions in it. One is, can capitalism manage the cycle of capitalist production of boom and bust to protect workers? And the other question is, of course, the bigger question: can capitalism be managed in order to protect nature? So I'm going to start by just dealing with the question posed by nature, and right. So you can all see this, I hope, and you're all perfectly familiar with it. And it's the very basic form of the water cycle. So the most fundamental issue about the water cycle and the other natural cycles is they're closed. So the input has to match the output. You know, anything goes in at one end has to come in again at the other. Another good example is the carbon cycle, which people are also familiar with. So if these cycles are broken, so if there's a disruption of the supply of fresh water, or if there's an overconcentration of carbon dioxide, natural cycle is thrown out of order. Now, I'll switch out of thing for a minute. Just as a background, I'm going to mention phosphorus. Like every other element on planet Earth, phosphorus has a cycle. And the cycle for phosphorus is timed at about 5 million years. So the phosphate industry gets most of its stuff from guano and from other deposits, and it's gone through them at a rate of knots. And it's not quite clear how we're going to wait 5 million years for the phosphate cycle to replenish itself. In addition to outputs, there are also new inputs. So the new inputs that people are familiar with are plastics, which have built up at an absolutely incredible rate, about 1 trillion tons in the ocean at the minute, and organophosphates, which are less mentioned, but they're completely new to nature. The first organic phosphate, DDT, caused an enormous fuss, and it was eventually banned, but it was replaced by lots of other organophosphates. And now we're getting reports that bees and other pollinators are getting to be in short supply, and that the amount of insect life available has fallen by a third in some sections of the planet. These inputs are unnatural, but in actual fact there is a natural response by nature, and that natural response is called mass extinction. The natural cycle becomes unstable. It collapses in the form it exists, and the dominant species of the time become extinct. Then there's a period of less activity, and then new species and new ecosystems arise to replace the old one. So when we talk about saving the planet, that's really a misnomer. What we're talking about is saving the humans. If I can give you an example, one overexcited reporter investigating the story of invertebrate extinction, asked a scientist, did that mean that the insects were going to go extinct? To which the scientist replied with a merry laugh, not at all. By the time that happened, vertebrate life would have been extinct for 1,000 years. So it's us we're talking about, not nature. The other thing I want to mention is the Bronze Age solution, which is held by quite a number of Greens, which is that our lives are too complex. So if we go back to hunting, fishing, and making bronze spears, all will be well. Well, that's a self-imposed mass extinction. The number of humans that planet Earth would support in a Bronze Age economy is about a millionth of what exists at the minute. The second thing I want to mention is that what we're talking about now is mitigation. Most scientists would accept that there's no argument now. The Earth is warming up, pollution is building up, species are going extinct, the sea level is rising, and it's too late to do anything much about that. There's at least 20, so the response from humans will have to be mitigation. How can we avoid this getting any worse? How can we reduce the impact? And the main thing I want to say about this before I go on to the economy is to say that what Marx and Engels talked about most is an organic connection with nature. So the idea that we can dominate nature, just exploit it or ignore it, is just foolish. What we have to do is understand it in a deeper way and build our own society and economy within a natural order. Now, I'm going to go on to something else, which is, I think, this picture here. Hold on, I have to turn on. There it is there. Hold on. I'll try this now. That's it now, sorry. Okay, so this is not actually very, very accurate, but basically it draws attention to the main element of Marxism, which is that money becomes capital when it's joined with labour power to produce commodities and therefore to produce profit. And that new money, that expanded amount of money, then has to be reinvested. So that means that what's shown here is a circle, is actually a spiral, and it's an uncontrolled spiral. If I can mention what I consider to be the worst aspect of reformist Marxism or opportunist Marxism, is when they talk about greedy capitalists and greedy bankers. And that is an enormous distortion of how society works. The class struggle isn't just between capitalists and workers, it's between capitalists and capitalists. You either make a profit or you don't, and you go under. So everybody holding capital has to keep increasing that capital. Now, is there any way of controlling that? That's obviously a chaotic system. Well, the main means of control is the state. The state regulates capital. But there are limits to that. It's a capitalist state, so the regulation of capital has to be in the overall interest of capital. So it's in the overall interest of capital that there's not people shooting each other in the streets to advance their particular capitalist cause. So there's police forces and rules and laws and that sort of thing. And that's an example of capitalism in the form of state standing over the individual capitals to preserve order. The other limit on that is it's limited by national boundaries. So if you're in a state, you can apply sort of fairly fixed laws. But if you're outside the state in the global market, you're looking at trade. The Greens go crazy about is the Paris Accord. But in actual fact, as the French who were holding the Paris Conference will admit, they wrote the Paris Statement so that everybody would agree with to it. It wasn't written as a list of things that had to be done to meet the needs of the planet. It was written because everybody would sign off. It was as weak as water. And even then, a couple of months later, the US had pulled out. And nobody really oversees what the rest of them are doing. What happens is they're going to meet in Glasgow and say, how did you get on? So the other thing that has to be mentioned is that the room for manoeuvre, that is what you can do when you're trying to control individual capitals and trying to apply regulation, is limited by the rate of profit. And the tendency is for the rate of profit to fall and for it become more and more difficult to do that. Now, the theories about this, about controlling capital, are the Keynesian theory and the classical. So the classical theory is that capitalism regulates itself. So there'd be a bust, but that will create the conditions for a boom and everything will get back on a steady cycle again. And Keynes said, no, we have to smooth this out. So what we do is we go counter-cyclical. Productivity is raised. Now, really, these theories are beside the point to direct capital. There are things that academics dream up in the aftermath to explain capital. Really, there's just capital, and it does whatever it needs to survive. A good example would be in 2011, Ireland was saddled with an enormous banker's debt and went through 10 years of austerity to pay that. But now we're faced in 2020 with coronavirus, and the Irish state's spending money like water. So it's doing exactly the opposite to what it did in the 2011 crisis. But that's what it needs to do to survive. So nobody's too worried about the theory. Of course, applying Keynesian ideas, what it is you borrow money, and eventually the workers have to pay the money back. And what a lot of the current economic steps that are being taken they're being taken to they'll be taken on the basis that money is cheap, that there's very little cost to borrowing money, and you'll be able to run a big deficit and paying back without building up a big bill in terms of interest. If that were to continue, if cheap money were to continue indefinitely, then capitalism would cease to exist because there would be no profit motive. If it doesn't continue, then there's a mass assault on the workers building up, right? So can the capitalist system be used to control the destruction of nature? And the answer is no, it can't. It's an irrational system. It runs on profit. That is, if you look at the program of the Trump administration in America, it's essentially just to make profit. So all sorts of methane release, they've been torn up so that you can burn more stuff. And if the stuff's there to be, and if there's a problem in making a profit, then the regulations that prevent you making a profit will be thrown to one side. Some people argue that, okay, capitalism can't solve it, but one thing that I think capitalism has is it has innovation. So before you know where you are, every house will be covered in solar panels, and we'll all be running electric vehicles. Well, two things happen there. One is that new technology has to insert itself into the market that already contains old technology. So if you wanted to replace everything with solar power, the cost of installation and use of solar power would have to be a fraction of the cost of just pumping some oil out of the ground and burning it. So if you wanted to put a date on when a solar economy would jump into place, it would be 1,000 years in the future or something like that. It's not a good example. Two good examples. One is the drive towards hybrid cars and electric cars. Now, hybrid cars are petrol cars. They're petrol vehicles with bigger batteries. Now, as a result of those bigger batteries, they are much more fuel efficient. But in actual fact, it would probably be a lot better just to hold on to the old cars and repair them, rather than roll out millions of new cars and use up all the resources required to produce them. Another example is your urge to recycle your plastic. But in actual fact, very little of the plastic that you go to the trouble of sorting out and putting in special containers is recycled. And the reason for that is that it's cheaper to make plastic out of raw materials than it is to recycle it. So most people don't bother theirs, and most industries don't bother theirs. Things like electric cars and plastic recycling are used to provide sort of window dressing. Now, a big argument of Greens and eco-socialists is this is so terrible that the capitalists will realize how terrible it is and they change direction. Well, that's not actually the case. First of all, what they do is they hire a lot of scientists to prove that there isn't a climate degradation and keep on as before. Secondly, when there is such degradation, the capitalists are going to be the last people to feel it. And as I say, we're already into this capital degradation. So let's give an example. What's the example of capitalist degradation and climate degradation? Well, the example is the flood of migration across the world. What's the capitalist response to this millions of people on the move, living in desperation? What's the response? The response is to just bury them in prisons, that put them in situations where they all drown or something like that, to whip up public racism against the migrants. It's not to solve the problem. There's no interest in solving the problem. Their interest is to keep it away from themselves. Same thing's happening with water levels rising. I mean, there's about half a dozen South Pacific nations that are sinking onto the sea, and they are going to sink onto the sea. Now, nobody's saying this is a wake-up call. We'll have to do something about this. They're just ignoring the poor bastards as they they go under. So how do we get over all this? Well, we're in the same position with climate change as we are with all the other crises of modern society, which is, as socialists, we believe that self-organization of the working class is the required response. And I wouldn't say there's no activity of working class, but it's sort of like it's local bubbles of activity that never get a grip on a broader, but rarely become a more major mobilization. Although you're seeing something of those sorts of mobilizations in Latin America at the moment, and so on. So how do we correct for that? Well, I think first of all we have to produce more coherent theory, and there's quite a lot of theory about that we can support. Theory of environmentalism, theory of eco-socialism, and there's nothing wrong with these theories, so we should try to popularize this ourselves. Secondly, there's activism. Again, there's plenty of people who are active on trying to prevent the destruction of the planet, the destruction of human society, even though they are a minority, and we should support that. We shouldn't nitpick when people are active. We should support them. But what we have to do as socialists is to provide a class analysis. Say, look, this is a job for the workers. There has to be self-organization of the workers to do that. And whenever we see that, that's what we should seize on to. Unfortunately, at the moment, Ireland's at the bottom of the pile, and has been for generations. The last thing that interests Irish capitalism is protecting the environment, and what we have as a Green Party is probably the most right-wing Green Party in Europe, and essentially everybody's inside the tent, hoping that our reliance on imperialism will see us through. So that's the essential outline.